Hi, good afternoon. I think we're going to get started. So we have time for questions at the end. Hi. I don't usually use the mic. It maybe makes me uncomfortable. All right. Okay. Somi Amalu is exhibitions curator at the Riva and David Logan Center for the Arts at the University of Chicago, where she oversees international contemporary art programming in the Logan Center and throughout the Art Center. Amalu also holds a position of lecturer in the Humanities Division at the University of Chicago. She specializes in global contemporary art and spatial practices, and recently curated Kapwani Kiwanga, The Sum and Its Parts, and so-called Utopias at the Logan Center Gallery. Prior to joining the Logan, she was assistant curator at the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum at MSU, where she curated material effects, contemporary art from West Africa and the diaspora, John Akumfra, Imaginary Possessions, and the land grant Forest Law. She was previously curatorial fellow at the Visual Arts at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, where she curated the Museum of Non-Participation, The New Deal. Her projects have received grants from the NEA, the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Harper Foundation, the Elizabeth Firestone Graham Foundation, and the British Council. Her writing has appeared in numerous catalogs and journals, including Art in America, After Images, the Journal of Media Arts and Cultural Criticism, and the Studio Museum in Harlem Studio Magazine. This is her second visit to MCAD. She lectured here in 2012 and while she was the curatorial fellow at the Walker. I think many of you have met her there last time, where she spoke for the exhibition MCAD Intersections, Women, Leadership, and the Power of Collaboration. Please join me in giving a warm MCAD welcome to Somi Amalu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? No? Okay, I need to do this then. Just bear with me a second. Better? Okay, fantastic. I forgot how to cue the presentation. While he comes down, oh, there I am. Thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for joining me this afternoon for what I hope will be interesting talk and conversation. I wanted to start by saying thank you very much to the folks here at MCAD, particularly Gretchen and members of the Visual Arts faculty for the invitation, and to Kylie for all her help in organizing my visit. It's really nice to come back. I kind of feel like Minneapolis is my home in some way, shape, or form. I really came to age as a curator here, and I have very fond memories of being in Minneapolis and to sharing with the arts community here. Today I'm actually going to talk to you about an exhibition that I curated a couple of years ago while I was at the Broad Art Museum in Michigan. I wanted to use it as an opportunity for you guys to get an insight into some of the key motivations of my practice. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about how this exhibition, Material Effects, has spurred a long-term research project that I'm about to start and I'm currently in the process of at the Logan Center. So the project was called Material Effects, Contemporary Art from West Africa and the Diaspora, and it was the culmination of over a year of research and conversation of what I believe was a really exceptional group of contemporary artists. And although they all originated from West Africa, their reach was very international, and I believe the show was a testament to the currency and strength of their work. So I'll talk through the process of conceiving the show and then use this opportunity to expand on some of its core themes and motivations. And hopefully I'll speak for about 40 minutes or so. And I'd really like to open up to conversation, to questions afterward, which can be related to what I present here, or if you might have some questions about my trajectory or other parts of my practice, I'd be very happy to answer those as well. So the journey towards realizing Material Effects really began here in the space between two quotes, one by cultural anthropologist Aruna Padurai and the other by Senegalese artist Issa Samb. And I'm setting these two side by side here to illustrate that this exhibition really sprang from thinking about these two individuals and their reflections on the status of objects and materiality in contemporary life. The exhibition takes its title from an extract in a Paderais 2006 essay, The Thing Itself, which is also where the quote that you see up here is coming from, reflecting on his earlier writings on the idea that objects have biographies and orchestrate social relations in the similar way to humans. Paderais speculates on the nature of objects in spaces where, and I quote, the social life of things is both rich and undisciplined, enough to counter the logic of Western capitalism. In these spaces, and Paderais cites India as an example, he asserts that the materiality of objects wins over their abstraction into commodities, and that they have multifarious lives that can be really fully articulated in this context. Crucially, a Paderais text is also about the status of the art object in spaces that are yet to be fully subsumed by the logic of global capitalism. And it is really a call to artists. He ends the text by giving a call to artists, curators, and historians to maintain an understanding of the thing itself, to privilege materiality of abstraction, and to understand the social life of things. And these ideas became very crucial when one thinks about the works that I will talk about in the exhibition and the very specific context of West Africa that they are coming from. And I came to a Paderais text after I had visited West Africa at the beginning of 2015 to conduct research for the exhibition. I spent about 2 weeks in Lagos, Accra, Abuja, and Dakar, meeting artists and visiting institutions. And I came away from the trip with a whole host of conversations that really reflected the vibrant and diverse nature of artistic production in the region. And my final stop was Dakar, Senegal, where I spent a large portion of my time in the company of a close contact of Issa Samb. And although I didn't get to meet Issa himself, one of the last places I spent and visited was his Courtyard Studio in the center of Dakar. And the image that you see here is one of the images from this studio. I'd been aware of Sam's work for a while, as he really is one of the godfathers of African avant-garde art practice. And I had had the opportunity to visit his brilliant solo show in London that was presented in 2014 at Innova. And so during this trip, Issa's work was really very fresh in my mind. However, the experience of visiting his space was altogether very different. From seeing discrete objects in the gallery, as I had done in the exhibition at Innova. And it was really this experience of spending time here that laid the foundations for the direction of the exhibition. And so Sam's studio is the stuff of art historical folklore. It was an important site and still continues to be an important site in the formation of the Laboratoire Agit Art, which was an interdisciplinary and politically minded artistic collective founded in 1974 by Samb and his peers in Dakar. Looking to settle dominant art practices and institutional frameworks in post-independent Senegal, the Laboratoire worked across disciplinary forms to open up the creative process to improvisation, temporality, and hybridity, with Sam's studio serving as a site for many of their activities. In this space, as you can see, it's a courtyard that is full of a myriad of objects. Samb and his co-conspirators became mediators between things, working in a manner that harnessed energy and put it into new formations as sculptural assemblage, but also as performance, as interventions. And these forms were always temporary, and they were always intended to be temporary. And the objects in this space, which Sam would collect over time, they might be things that he found during his daily walks across the city. They might be things that people brought to him, or somehow ended up in his possession. He would repurpose them and reconfigure them over time. And as they became reconfigured, the space also held different moments of thinking, making, and performing. So it really is this dynamic continuous installation. And there are objects in this space that date back to the 1970s and post-independence years of Senegal to the very contemporary moment. So in some ways, it's this sort of living archive of a variety of curious objects, as it were. Here's just another image. So after visiting Sam's studio, it became very clear to me that there was a strong correlation between Apadurai's description of the profusion of objects in India and the context that Sam was working in. Through his work in philosophical writing, Sam has privileged the immediacy of the object, perceiving it to have, and I quote, a force, a life that signifies and does so independently of our volition, of our needs, of our wishes, and our aesthetic concerns, to make objects go into those directions that we indicate them to be. And so Sam was part of something I think is really important, is that Sam was part of a sort of like radical Marxist community also in Senegal. And so they were inherently counter Western capitalism, and they believed in a sort of Marxist vein, but also very much related to indigenous traditions and connections to the lives of objects. They believed that objects could have far more meaning than within the capitalist system. And so in this way, for me, Sam and Apadurai shared an understanding of the thing itself, emphasizing the autonomy of the object beyond the reaches of commoditization and other assigned values established through human intervention. And so in musing about the relationship between Sam and Apadurai, but also having experienced these urban centers in West Africa and seeing the way in which there was this proliferation and profusion of objects in public space, it seemed only natural that I would convene a group of artists that were working in and around this idea of thinking through the status of the object. And so what I tried to do with the exhibition was to bring these two perspectives together and have them welcome you into the gallery. So the exhibition included work by 6 contemporary artists from West Africa and the diaspora, half of which were commissioned newly for this presentation, and the other half were existing works. And this is just a view of the entrance of the gallery. And so when you enter, you would be confronted with material effects, which was the title of the show, which obviously alluded to Apadurai's writing. And then Sam was immediately at the entrance of the exhibition in the form of a video work by a German artist called Ance Mayuski, which you can see here just to the left of this image. And so the aim with placing Sam in the entrance to the gallery was to try and think about his voice in the development of contemporary art practice within a West African context. And watching this piece, which is this really beautiful interview profile of this obviously very legendary figure in his Courtyard Studio, for me was very, very, very much poetic. And he spends about 45 minutes talking exactly about the status of objects as he saw them, as he understood them to be. And watching this piece, it's hard not to be struck by his clarity of vision and really his steadfast commitment to a radical understanding of objects and man's relationship to them. And the intent in placing him at the entrance of the exhibition was that his voice would somehow permeate throughout the other galleries, not literally, of course, but rather subliminally. And the ultimate hope was that he would introduce the viewer to a series of ideas that they would then take with them as they engage with the other works in the exhibition. But I think most importantly, Sam's presence links the contemporary perspectives on view in the exhibition to an artistic avant-garde in West Africa dating back to the 60s and 70s. And in many ways, I saw the other artists in the show as drawing influence and building on this heritage, whether or not they did so consciously or subconsciously. And for me, Samb, and I think for many people, for many scholars of African art, contemporary African art, he really represents a very revolutionary spirit of creativity in the context of the region. And that for me, I saw many affinities between his approach to making and thinking about objects with some of the more younger artists in the exhibition. And I think it's important, something to note is that Sam has been sort of reclaimed as a figure in contemporary times, but his kind of position within the kind of context of Senegal remains very, very resistant to dominant ways of thinking and dominant narratives. And in fact, the studio has experienced some vandalism in recent years as a result of his kind of political position with respect to how he chooses not only to execute his practice, but also chooses to live his life. So it was important for me to think about Sam's work alongside the work of a much younger artist, and really from the other spectrum of West Africa, Anglophone West Africa, a Ghanaian artist called Ibrahim Mohamed, who I met during my first trip when I visited Accra and spent some time in his studio. And here's an image of Ibrahim in his studio. And I immediately began to draw parallels between Ibrahim's practice, which is really interested in not producing finite art objects, but rather interested in process and ideas of sculptural assemblage and interventionism in public space. I started to connect that very much so with Sam's practice. And since 2012, Mohamed has been daringly occupying civic spaces in his home country, market spaces, transit points, building sites with large-scale draped works constructed from used jute sacks. So a jute sack is a burlap sack. And these sacks have a history that kind of goes back to the cocoa trade in Ghana, but also connected to the coal industry and also other forms of microeconomies in the country. And in this context, as you see, this is kind of how they started to appear throughout Accra and other cities in Ghana. In this context, they are stark interventions to the fabric of everyday life, and his sculptural works really elevate a material which is very everyday, in some ways a very practical object, but really nothing particularly special. They really elevate it into an object of contemplation. And the reason Mohamed was interested in working with this material was exactly because of its proliferation through different spheres of the Ghanaian economy and social spaces. These are sacks that you see everywhere. They are carried by traders, market people, laborers who use them for different purposes. And as I mentioned, the life of the object typically starts actually outside of Ghana in the present day, outside of Ghana, and is produced and then imported in, where it gets used in the coal industry and also to transport daily goods. So he was really interested in thinking about the life of this object and how it travels through different spaces, and how one could start thinking about the complexity and richness of that. And what is really, I think, great and something that reaches beyond the kind of aesthetic of the work is that Mohamed's work and engagement really works through a form of gift exchange and conversation. And so as well as collecting, he's really recycling and reclaiming these objects. He is also learning about the different trade routes all through the country. And he's meeting tradesmen as they are traveling up and down Ghana and bartering with them actually for these pieces of fabric. And so what he might suggest to a tradesman is that he would give them a new set of burlap sacks or a tool or something that they needed for their profession in exchange for the used sacks. And that kind of continues on and on. And so I think there's a really kind of interesting point about collaboration and conversation that is embedded in the works itself. And also something that's quite interesting about the process is that he works a lot in order to make these works. He works a lot with migrant laborers from the north of the country, mainly women who kind of travel down to the big cities to make money and then send off to their families in their villages. And each constellation of people that come together around his work really is a result of very individual conversations and finding ways to bring people into the process. And so the kind of production unit can become as large as like 50, 60, 100 people in making these works. So much like Sam's practice, Mohamed's engagement with the jute sack and its transformation into an art object is really entirely based on process and the spontaneous creative energies of his production team. And it's also clear in the making of the work that there is also this kind of like shared learning and kind of skills exchange that happens. And people don't come together around the work as a result of a particular skill set, but as a result of a desire to be in conversation with the artist who invites them into his art making process. And so you might find women who are just market traders, you might find seamstresses, you might find individuals with other skills that come together and kind of share their knowledge in making the pieces. And when I talked to Ibrahim about his work, it was really very much also about engaging with a sort of different socioeconomic community that he would never do other than within the context of his practice, and trying to open up those lines of communication. And so there's this kind of impulse to have a working ethos that's about collaboration, that's about exchange, and working with the resources at hand. And so once he compiles his production unit of individuals, the works take this form, which are large-scale pieces that are kind of composed of different jute sacks that come from different parts of the country and bear the residues of these different places that they have been. And so you might find on the jute sack the initials of its original owner. You might find the stamp of the company that imported it in. You might find fingerprints. There will be other forms of residue that appear in this material. And so he had been working within the context of Accra for a very long time, and when I invited him to do the show, he had just finished a large-scale installation for the Venice Biennial, which was one of the pieces in the Arsenale at Okwi and Weza's Biennial. And so I invited him to present a large-scale installation at the Broad MSU, and this is what he came up with, which was really trying to find a way to fully occupy the architecture of the building. I don't know if you know much about the building, but it is a Zaha Hadid building, her only second building in the United States, and has a really kind of stark and futurist-looking architecture with these beautiful angles. And right actually underneath this mass of fabric is a huge window that looks out into downtown East Lansing. And actually he was interested in closing off that view and kind of creating an interior space with this draped work. And so what I learned a lot about his process was that for him, whereas when he was working in an urban space, he was very much interested about the proximity of the works to different communities of people, right? So it might be in a transit station, or it might be in a market, and he was interested in that proximity and how, through his intervention, there would be kind of a shifting of the understanding of this object, which you might find in an area very adjacent to where it was placed. But obviously coming into the gallery poses a different set of challenges for him. And of course, this is East Lansing, and the kind of cultural context is very, very different. But what I learned about him was that he was an artist that loved to work kind of in response to architecture. And he was very much interested in composition. So this is not just a selection of jute sacks that are sewn together. He's really interested in thinking about how they meet the wall and the floor, the different textures that they have. And each, you can think of it as being made up of a series of tapestries that are sewn together. And so they are very kind of intentional moves that he made within this composition. And so I think that the way that Ibrahim works in terms of reusing and responding to sight really promotes the idea of the mutability of the object. And within this context, he, I think, was responding to and working in very much similar ways and trying to refute the ways in which kind of we're used to the ideas of permanence within the gallery space and the compulsion that an art object has to be kind of one thing. And what was interesting also was that he was very, very much concerned that our visitors would engage with the works themselves. And so there was free reign to kind of occupy the space, because that is the life of the object, that is the essential quality of these jute sacks. And so to kind of call for a sort of distance viewing of the work would be, I think, to deny the jute sacks their kind of essential quality. And something I think also important to note is that a lot of his works kind of are made up of the residues of previous works and previous interventions. And so that when we finished this project, the work was deinstalled and the material was then reused for another installation. And so there is this kind of interest in a sort of kind of cyclical reuse and repurposing of the object. So an acceptance of the shifting state of things forms the core of another artist, Autobahn Canga, who was featured in the exhibition. Her practice very much develops around an interest in the shifting states of natural and man-made objects. Investigating political, environmental, and material histories, the artist often begins her projects with an intense archival process, and this approach provides a historical lens on how particular objects and materials have been circulated globally, and how they have been used in different locations. She's interested in what really connects human beings and our experiences of the world, more broadly speaking. She was born in Nigeria, but spent a considerable amount of time in Europe. But so she's also interested in this idea of kind of the in-between zone and an object that has a sort of like in-between identity or can be conceived differently in different spaces. And her work often begins with the memory of a smell, a taste, a feeling that forges links between her experiences in Nigeria to those in new contexts that she has found herself. And through these memories, she maps connections between spaces and trying to think of ways in which we are tied to each other, no matter kind of irrespective of our origins. And for her, she's particularly interested in the material world and the natural world as this crucial connecting point. She understands that we kind of live under a kind of shared earth, experiencing the same essential elements of the material world and sustaining ourselves through the exploitation of the earth's natural resources like iron, oil, coal, mica, which eventually become commodities that drive our shared global economy. And so as part of the exhibition, we presented a work that is part of an ongoing series by the artist called Contained Measures, which reflects on the interconnectedness of humans to objects and is really interested in this idea of the manipulation of matter, but also doing this through a research-based study of raw materials. In these works, the artist extrapolates the histories of materials as well as their meaning and values across communities and connects them to a multi-sensory experience in the gallery. And so this is an image of the piece which we eventually showed as part of the exhibition. It's called Contained Measures of a Kola Nut. For this piece, she consulted the archive of a sort of agronomic research development organization in France. And she was interested in looking at the history of the kola nut, which is a fruit that's native to rainforest in West Africa. And she was interested in thinking about how the kola nut was used within kind of indigenous cultures, and then how it ended up having a life outside of the region, the kind of originating region of the fruit itself. And so we showed alongside this kind of central table, which brings together different research elements that look at the significance of the kola nut tree. The kola nut is a sort of kind of mild stimulant that is used in West Africa, and it's chewed every single day, like usually by men, sort of like tobacco. But it also becomes a tool for conversation. And so people would gather together, they'd chew kola nut together, and they'd have a conversation and might kind of sit outside for a couple of hours before moving on to the next thing. But the kola nut was, because of its kind of stimulant properties, it was eventually exported around the world, and originally was one of the key components of Coca-Cola. And so that's where kind of the cola comes from. And so the research that you see at the table kind of maps this trajectory of the object. And obviously you're thinking about the relationship of the nut to kind of community conversations, but then at the same time thinking about how it moved outside of Africa through, actually was brought by slaves in slave ships, and eventually ended up in Brazil before moving up to kind of the rest of the Americas, right? So it has a very different and pointed kind of life at different stages of its evolution. So according to the artist, memory is not only an autobiographical state, but it's also an important notion in relation to objects that leave traces. And we see this articulated in the installation itself. So she's interested at the traces that the kola nut leaves in the different locations that it kind of finds itself. But also we see this kind of quite materially in the exhibition, where you have this kola nut extract which drips continuously from a decanter through the course of the exhibition, becoming kind of a tool to sketch these sort of improvisational journeys. And so she's also in the making of the work, she has kind of reimagined a new purpose for the kola nut itself. And I think one of the many things about Autobahn's practice is that she's really interested in this idea of impermanence and temporality. And so there's always some sort of shifting state that is happening, a sort of like material that shifts state all through the course of the exhibition, which I think very much reflects Sam Benapadirai's thinking about the life of objects. Apadirai's text also speaks about new forms of art outside of the traditional plastic arts, including performance art, body art, and action art that, I quote, exploit the vulnerability of objects to change, to take advantage of the corrosive effects of history and context, and incorporate the mortality of the artist and the body into the fabric of the artwork itself. And this idea holds true in particular for two performance artists in the exhibition, Jalili Atiku, whose work you're seeing here, and Bernard Akore Jackson, who I will move on to shortly, whose installations were primarily sites or performance works that happened during the exhibition's opening weekend. With a sense of urgency, Atiku uses performance as a pivotal social commentary to address kind of notions of trauma, poverty, and environmental deterioration in his immediate context of Lagos in Nigeria. And he really typically takes to the streets of Lagos, which, if any of you know, is a very vibrant and kind of rich context, in order to perform performances that really draw on the kind of long history of kind of processional practices in West Africa, and also processional practices connected to his own indigenous Yoruba culture. And so concealing his body, usually beneath brightly colored costumes or thick layers of mud, tar, paint, the artist feathers himself with rope, plastic strips, and balloons, and various other found objects. And his hope is to kind of draw attention using a very vivid visual language, which in some ways has to stand beyond the already rich kind of cultural and material context of Lagos in order to have a sort of like deep impact on everyday citizens. And so Red Day, which was a performance that he presented as part of the opening of the exhibition, was the 17th iteration of an ongoing performance by the artist called In the Red. Initiated in 2008, In the Red addresses the subject of global warfare and violence and human impulses towards those things. And according to the artist, unquantifiable amounts of blood have been spilled on this earth, and thus humanity has been mummified in red and jumps in horror here and there. And In the Red adopts the use of the shroud, the color red, and the historical and contemporary narratives of war as materials that symbolize the artist's meditation on life, suffering, danger, and destruction. And he was interested in wrapping the human body in the red cloth, in red cloth, and then to perform a series of kind of actions within the gallery space. Working through spontaneous and improvised actions, In the Red expresses outrage in the face of calamitous events our world over, including kind of forms of violence that the artist was reflecting on at the time that were kind of particular to that moment of presentation. And so this is the artist during the performance at the Broad MSU. And his aim, at least, through a sort of kind of stark aesthetic and performance language, was to kind of lend voice to the kind of psychological and physical effects of violence in order to kind of have a sort of like broader resonance within the viewership. And so the installation at the Broad MSU, I'm just going to skip back for a couple of slides, started off as this, a series of mannequins that were covered with these red hoods and a series of costumes that lay at their feet. And he worked with a group of 11 performance students at the Broad MSU to start the performance in the gallery, where they would wear these red shrouds, and then they would move out into the gallery and then outside into the building, working through some sort of like workshopped actions that they had practiced earlier on, but also I think working quite spontaneously together. And so the idea was that this performance would happen and did happen throughout the building, and then it returned back into the exhibition space, where it was then kind of transferred back onto the mannequins. And in this process, there's this sort of kind of automatic writing that's happening amongst the group as they're kind of meditating on some of the subject matter that they had encountered in conversation with the artist, but also maybe some of their present feelings about this form of kind of collective expression. And so here are the mannequins being reclothed again. And so I think the idea with this performance was that there would be some sort of material residue that remained in this space, and so that these objects would forever be kind of imbued with those actions. And I think one of the reasons why I was struck by Jalali's work was that his work is very much dealing with kind of human rights issues within the context of Nigeria more specifically. And this idea of kind of revisiting the histories of kind of masquerading or sort of public interventionism, but with a sort of like political intent, has been something that has been, I think, come as a surprise to a lot of people within Nigeria, and actually propose a sort of new type of engagement with kind of social political issues, to the extent in which that he gets arrested for his work, because he's speaking quite kind of vocally about some very kind of problematic issues within the country. And so Jalali will actually represent, will be in the Venice Biennial this year as one of the main artists in the main shows, but he's kind of a really key figure in thinking about human rights within the Nigerian context. And I think this idea of kind of going back to sort of kind of social and political activism links back to the work of the Laboratoire Agita. And I think something that I maybe forgot to mention was that this group formed in the 1970s, really in a sort of post-independence era, thinking about about a way to have a political voice within a context where there was seemingly a much more kind of dictatorial government or kind of government policies that were coming into place that weren't serving the citizens. So they were really keen on collectivizing and really proposing new forms in order to kind of shift a sort of political context. And I see Jaleli doing the same thing in his practice. Also seeking to address societal questions through performance, Ghanaian artist Bernard Akoi-Jackson, who you see here during a performance in Accra in Ghana, takes a slightly different tact in his work. And he usually uses humor, absurdity, wonder, and fiction to kind of confront the intersection of African identity with waves of globalization. He often takes the persona of a wise spiritual leader or deity and works with fictional narratives. And so here, as you can see, this is one of the kind of personas that he takes on. And he's often dressed in different kind of garb that is kind of completely imagined by him. But they might infer some sort of kind of like indigenous use of color or kind of a textile that is familiar. But then he kind of remixes them with other kind of external factors. And he is, in doing this work, he's kind of alluding to kind of ancient, yet kind of spiritual practices, but talking about kind of very contemporary conditions in terms of how African identity is perceived both externally and internally, right? So it's all about the image of Africa and what that looks like within a sort of local context, but also an international context. According to the artist, he says, "What I do in my art is to present things that look authentic but are inherently fake, or rather deliberately constructed, in order to push people towards questioning." And for the exhibition at the Broad, he presented a work that really kind of plays with the idea of truth and fiction, or maybe more accurately, plays with our preconceptions of various identities or various spaces. And in particular, he was interested in thinking about institutional spaces within the West African context and the use of bureaucracy within those spaces, a bureaucracy that he saw to be kind of a vestige of the kind of colonial intervention, but something that has settled and is at odds with a sort of like contemporary life in the country. And so wishing to kind of restage kind of a sort of participatory setting for a sort of critique of bureaucracy. He wanted viewers to engage with the piece, which you see here is a series of platforms, is this platform with what looks like to be a sort of like pseudo office setting with some materials on the table and a series of instructions that you are kind of invited to carry out. But what was essential about this performance is that these tasks were completely non-essential and redundant in order to kind of evoke the frustrations and tensions of the bureaucratic systems that we encounter on a daily basis. And then within this installation itself, there are references to kind of the history, the kind of tainted history of material exploitation in West Africa. And so you see in this podium in front here, these cubes that are covered with bits of sugar, cotton, and chocolate to think about the complexities of West African cultural identity, how that links to kind of the history of colonialism, and how we're always kind of like in this absurd mix of kind of like historical factors. So for the performance, in order to kind of activate the performance, he proceeded to engage in a procession that took place through the gallery, which started off in the main gallery, and he did this very beautiful kind of walk-in, this slow walk-in around the perimeter of the gallery, and then drew people into the second gallery where they were invited to kind of engage in this performance. And we were able to work with a number of students from Broad MSU who were sort of our facilitators. And Bernard has a very kind of crude, a crude type of humor in that the whole aim of this performance was to kind of frustrate people. And so there were folks that were in the know and that weren't in the know. And there were seemingly processes that seemed like they were kind of straightforward, but then they were kind of circuitously kind of undercut by somebody else. And also the kind of humor of having to wear this strange jumpsuit and kind of engage in this task, and that's it, and then you get off and you don't exactly know what has happened to you through this process. So here, just a few images. So at the end, for your kind of laborious work and engagement, you get a piece of chocolate at the end of it, which he found like very, very amusing. So the last artist in the show, and the artist that I will end with, is an artist called Zora Opoku, whose work was installed alongside Bernard Echo Jackson's work. She is an artist who is of German Ghanaian origin and has for a number of time been really interested in kind of the rich history of West African textiles. And for her, she kind of is interested in investigating how individual personalities and identities are imbued onto the textiles that we choose to wear, and how kind of clothing can be a form of presentation, but it's also kind of be a way to kind of thwart and kind of undermine social, cultural, and gendered associations. So this is one of her kind of early works where she invites a number of her friends and family to sit for a portrait, but they're completely clothed by different bits of clothing from their wardrobe. And so it's this idea of masking, which obviously has a strong tradition within West African culture, but also a way to think about how we might make certain assumptions about a person depending on the type of clothing that they choose to wear. I think most crucially for Zora, she's an artist that grew up primarily in Germany and only came to her Ghanaian heritage very late in her life, and had always been kind of involved in the fashion industry. And textiles and fashion became a way for her to engage with kind of her cultural identity, and obviously to think about how textiles can really provide a barrier from the world, but also as a tool for communication with the world as well. For the exhibition, she presented a series of sculptural works that were really portraits of her family, kind of abstracted portraits of her family, alongside video works that used friends and family again within urban contexts in Accra, specifically in Ghana. And presenting these sort of bodies that kind of spoke to a sort of larger context and larger culture of textile histories, but also were kind of apart from it or somehow estranged from it. So they're these curious bodies with these bits of draped fabric, and they take on these stances through the course of the video works. So here she's really thinking about the body's relationship to architecture and nature, and how we assimilate or don't assimilate with our kind of broader context. And I'm just going to flip through because I'm conscious of the time, but here's another beautiful sculpture that she presented, which is actually a portrait of her mother, which is composed of actually items found in her mother's garden, and then kind of repurposed and reused in the gallery space. And this is the final exhibition. Needless to say, this was a very kind of ambitious project, and one that was very kind of useful to my kind of curatorial thinking, specifically around contemporary artists and how to support the commissioning of new work, but also how to connect that back to a sort of like art historical tradition. And I've always been a curator that's interested in the histories of the African diaspora, and to be able to kind of go to the region and do some really deep research was really kind of beneficial to my kind of evolution as a curator. And so this is where I find myself now. I'm currently exhibitions curator at the Logan Center Gallery at the University of Chicago. And we have a small gallery that presents, as Anna mentioned, international contemporary art within the context of the University of Chicago. And it's a gallery that tries to serve, and I think the building itself tries to serve an academic community, but also at the same time kind of serves a sort of South Side of Chicago community and the broader kind of Chicago art scene as well. And so in arriving to the Logan Center, which is a really kind of beautiful building that really encourages collaboration and interdisciplinary work and is really interested in forms of community and engagement, I'm obviously thinking, have been thinking of how to kind of bring some of my curatorial expertise to this context. And a project that I'm currently working on is to think about, again, follow through with my work on material effects, to think about the histories of the African diaspora, but how they kind of permeated and worked within the South Side of Chicago. And so this project really takes Pan-Africanism, which was a sort of a political movement that started at the turn of the century and was really quite global and transnational, and was thinking about ways to kind of forge solidarity amongst the African diaspora, kind of in the face of forms of kind of like hegemony and oppression. And it evolved from being a sort of political movement in bringing thinkers and writers and politicians together to also being a cultural movement and a way to kind of bring artists together. And in the 70s, in the late 60s and 70s, there were really a series of seminal congresses that were organized across West Africa that sought to bring huge portions of the African diaspora together to sort of celebrate a sort of shared cultural heritage. And that had a profound, and I think Pan-Africanism in general had a really profound effect on, or kind of some of the kind of political motivations of Pan-Africanism had a really strong effect on the South Side of Chicago, the Black arts movement, for example, in ways in which people were thinking about solidarity that was beyond the sort of nation state. And so my project kind of aims to map these trajectories and to talk about it with a sort of like within a sort of historical moment, but then to kind of do a very big kind of jump to the present day and think about how we think about solidarity today and what that looks like in the ways artists are kind of practicing through kind of forms of collectivity and collaboration. And so over the next 2 years, I'll be kind of embarking on these series of quite intense kind of public forums on the South Side of Chicago that will collaborate with a bunch of institutions there that will look quite systematically at some of the core themes, at least that I recognize in Pan-Africanism. The first one happening in 2017 around the idea of the return. And so it kind of takes the idea of what it means to return to a cultural history, to a movement, or to the site of Africa in developing one's artistic practice. And I think that's something that was a very kind of strong impetus between in the kind of emergence of Pan-Africanism, to move on to the idea of non-alignment and thinking about where do we differ and why do we differ, and how forms of cultural hybridity have kind of emerged over time. And this is really also very, very particularly spurred on some of the work around Issa Samba and the Laboratory Ajda, who are very, very much kind of working in a sort of like, not necessarily fully post-Pan-Africanist moment, but they were really interested in not thinking about reductive notions of African identity, and they were interested in cultural hybridity and where do we kind of locate those people in the work that we do. And then finally kind of come into the contemporary moment and thinking about forms of solidarity, horizons, where we meet again and why, and how artists are kind of working across international locations. So if you're interested, please stay up to date with what we're doing and kind of come down to Southside and see. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, yeah. Would you mind speaking up? Sorry.
I will speak up. In terms of talking about how you're I guess, curating these artists and working with these artists, in removing these, whether it's objects or ideals, out of where they may practice or where they culturally relate to in Africa, how have you found that those conversations have changed once you've brought them into a gallery space? For instance, Ibrahim's Jute projects, how in the terms of removing them from perhaps a more local context to the global context?
Good question. I think the key, and going back to my discussion and Padurai's work and Sam's work, is to kind of believe in the fluidity of objects. And I think that's an important value that they both hold very strongly, and that objects and things can have multiple identities, and they have the capacity to kind of translate over different spaces. And so those translations might be kind of prioritized differently, but they can always connect and they can always speak to an immediate environment. And so I think that was an essential sort of value that was embedded in some of the kind of thinkers that I was drawing on for the exhibition. And what was important for me also in trying to place Sam's voice in the gallery was exactly to address those questions, right? And he comes up with a lot of really kind of poetic and insightful responses to that, and reflects on how he does not understand, and this again back to the idea of like cultural hybridity, right? He doesn't understand in like essentializing objects, as he doesn't understand, he doesn't believe in essentializing human beings, and that we must be kind of open to understanding that objects serve different functions in different spaces. So I feel like that value was embedded in the exhibition, and I think that one of the strengths of the exhibition and what we sought to do, especially with the performances, was to sort of have a sort of liveness that was kind of present in the gallery space, and to bring some of the sort of actions and some of the sort of like sort of visceral kind of connections to the work, or that the artists hope to, in the actual exhibition itself. So I think for the most part, the exhibition was really well received. We obviously had a robust program of like public programs and conversations with students. And I think something I always look to as well is to, in my work, and I always often talk about this, is to not just present an exhibition and hope that a public will arrive and that they will immediately understand what the exhibition is about. But actually, I think a lot about creating constituencies around my exhibition, and that is something that happens well ahead of the presentation of the work. And so there was a sort of kind of like long process of embedding the ideas and kind of finding, I guess, people with similar mindsets within the academic community who could kind of help translate the conversation of this exhibition to their students, or kind of the broader context. So it was very much like a long kind of process of conversation. And I think that there definitely, by the time we came to the exhibition, there was a community that had already kind of gathered around the project, and they were primed to kind of receive the ideas there. But I think that also something to note is that these are artists that are continuously working within context. And so Ibrahim is not just doing interventions within public spaces in Ghana, he's working all around the world doing these interventions as well. Likewise with this Issa Samb and the work of the Laboratoire Agita, they were also interested in kind of constantly shifting forms. And I think that's the first priority of the artists that I was working with, so we hopefully reflected that in the exhibition. Yes?
To the point you just said about working with communities ahead of time, I'm curious, if this is broken down, the current project you're working on, fall, spring, fall, it seems almost like academic. You're just something, or semester, so I'm wondering how you're working with the University of Chicago and other institutions, potentially other educational institutions in Chicago, to produce this, and also any troubles you're having, any like exceptional like achievements you feel like you're making, like working with communities, or any frustrations you're having as you're kind of drawing these communities together?
I don't think there's any frustration now. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm because I'm actually working with cultural histories that are quite familiar to the context. And actually there's been a desire to mine those histories. And actually, so we had our first meeting in late January, and I was really struck by the kind of openness and the enthusiasm everyone had around this project. Mainly because it's that idea of kind of revisiting histories that have had profound effects on not just artistic production in the south side of Chicago, but the kind of cultural makeup and community of the south side of Chicago. But as I said, that have been maybe left aside or they've been forgotten, but there seems to be an urgency to kind of readdress these things. And so I'm working with, the meeting consisted of a bunch of organizations on the south side, people who are far more knowledgeable than I am about those kind of very specific histories. And so another thing that I'm very interested in my practice is to not kind of position myself as a curator that kind of presents, you know, the word, but that is, it's actually kind of like a process of collective learning. And so I'm really excited to learn from everyone around me as much as kind of they might learn from me. And I really am conceiving of it as a collaborative project. And so having, again, this kind of long process of engagement is super important. I've not had any frustrations yet. I'll let you know in a year's time, though. They might. I imagine they will emerge because these are also connections, and I think that I mean, people think about identity in various different ways, and I'm obviously coming from like a British context, and I'm understanding what it means to be of the African diaspora in a very different way than people might be in Chicago. But I think the point is that we're working at least, or trying to work at least, from like a very shared kind of point of origin. And that, I think, helps us as we move forward with the conversation. Oh, yeah.
Speak to sort of the heart of what it means, this, or what it means to you, having been on site, this great presence of the object. As far as, because all art objects have an object type.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something special going on here. And thank you, first of all, thank you for bringing such an in-depth presentation of this.
You're welcome.
But I can see it and I can feel it, but how would you speak directly about what that is? And what makes it different than, say, all, say, talking about, say, for instance, you were inspired in West Africa, but versus the rest of the world. What is it about this work? Why are these objects so alive and magnetic?
I think there's like a maybe, if we think about how these contexts are structured, and they're structured in a far more, I think, diverse economic kind of strata than one might perceive here. And I'm going to talk about this through kind of recently visiting India, and having read Apadarai's work and not visited India, but then visiting India and actually understanding what he means when he talks about the kind of proliferation and profusion of the object into everyday life, it's that materials and things are used with the level of freedom that looks different. It might not be entirely different, at least. It looks different from how we understand it to be from a kind of Western context. And it's not just that it looks different, it's actually kind of positioned and placed differently within those contexts. And I think that that sort of like freedom to kind of displace meaning continuously and to displace use continuously is part and parcel of, I think, a much more kind of like richer I think in economic context in which you have these microeconomies within microeconomies within microeconomies, where actually kind of reuse and repurposing is intrinsic to those contexts. Similarly with Lagos and Accra and everything else. And so I think that there's that, and I think there's also kind of just strong cultural associations that I can't speak fully to because I'm not fully kind of part of these contexts, that I think if you watch Sam's video, and you can go online and watch it, he kind of speaks to from a very kind of like specific Senegalese context. Hope that was useful. Yeah. It will be a combination. So I don't have enough time to go into it, but there's a rich history of kind of like transnational conversation between Chicago and West Africa in particular. And so it would be to mine those histories and to kind of bring artists back, or kind of artworks back, and then to set up a more kind of like contemporary conversation. So it's definitely a two-way thing that again comes out of something that is already an intrinsic value of that context. You're welcome. One final question, yeah.
The Nigerian female artist, could you please spell her name?
Autobahn Canga, Otobong, Nkanga, Nkanga.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you very much, guys.